What about the other side of the chamber? What are you noticing from them post-election in terms of they changing their tune that much when it comes to the question of climate and addressing that and investing in renewables, or is it still the same sort of songbook they're singing from?
I thought maybe after the election, the Conservative Party in Britain worked it out. You can't win elections until you're serious about climate change. David Cameron worked it out many years ago. It appears, I'm sorry to say, they haven't. If you show that you believe in climate change and you want to do something about it, you accept the modern world. If you don't accept that, then you are not fit for government in the modern world.
With the federal election well and truly in the rearview mirror, the Albanese government is rolling up their sleeves and the doors of the federal parliament are swinging open once again. This week's episode, we were lucky to catch some time with the Federal Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Labor's Chris Bowen. We did our best to squeeze in all of the most pressing energy questions into the half hour, and I think we just about nailed it, covering everything from hosting COP31 to the future of renewable energy investment and practical advice for climate activists working to organise for change. Coming up after a word from our sponsors. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday evening on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And our guest today is the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, and he's Labor's federal member for McMahon, which he's held that seat since 2004, I think. And more importantly, he's a regular listener to Socially Democratic. Chris Bowen, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Stephen. Yes, I'm a regular listener, but been a while since we've chatted.
It's funny you say that, because I was talking to Grace, our producer, during the week, and I said, let's get Chris back on the show. We haven't spoken to him in a while. And in my head, it's like 2 years. And I went back and checked. It was episode 16, August 2019.
There you go. So, yes.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. Bits happened in that.
I was starting to think that. I was going, well, first of all, Labor's won 2 elections since then, because when we did speak, we were just sort of coming off the back of losing the election in 2019, and we're talking about where do we go next. Yes, good to get you back on the show again. I was also just thinking, you're the first member of the Federal Parliamentary Caucus to appear on the show since our wonderful election victory earlier in the year. And the dust is obviously well and truly settled on that campaign. So I just want to actually keen to get your reflections on the campaign and the result itself.
So, the thing I think about, Stephen, apart from, the obvious about how good it is, et cetera, a couple of things. I just make a couple of observations, and I guess they're linked. One is, 6 months ago, any podcast, probably not yours, but any other podcast you do in the country on politics, they would assert to you as a matter of certain biblical fact that it was going to be a hung parliament and that there'd be a minority Labor government. And, you could argue, no, we're aggressively looking at seats, including the seats the Greens hold and independents hold, and, I think there's a pathway there for a majority Labor government. You could argue that, and they would think that you were insane. And so I'm not being particularly critical of those people, but I think it's a reminder that, there's conventional wisdom, and then sometimes that's even true. Like, obviously we're very pleased with the result, and it's surprised on the upside, but we always thought a majority Labor government was within reach if we campaign well. And, that's the way it panned out, to the great credit of the Prime Minister and the broad team. The other observation I'd make, particularly focused in my patch of climate change and energy, but I think, there are real issues where you have to work through, and we might touch on some of them about social license and community support and all that sort of stuff, and there's real concerns, and genuine issues, questions that people have, but there's also noise. And I think the key to being a good reformer and a good government is being to work out the difference between message and noise. And sometimes the community is sending you a message that they're unhappy about something, and sometimes it's noise. Again, I stress there are real issues that we have to take on board, but there's also disinformation, misinformation, noisy groups. Again, the Australian newspaper, basically asserted and wrote as a statement of fact that we were going to be in big trouble in our coastal seats because of offshore wind, and we're going to lose, Patterson and Cunningham. Swings to Labor in both of those seats, almost one Forest, which is the seat where the Western Australian offshore wind is. It's a lot more complicated and nuanced than a lot of commentators would pretend to you it is.
How do you? I mean, you've been doing this a while now. How do you separate out that noise yourself?
I think you've just got to do as much sort of listening to the arguments, listening to the people, listening to the MPs, working out, what's going on here, not reading it in the newspapers. Again, if you read some newspapers, you believe no one in the region supports action on climate change. It's the exact opposite of the truth. Now, there's some people in the regions who say, yeah, this has got to happen. We accept that, and we accept there can be benefits for the regions, but we also think it could be done better. There could be better planning of this transmission line, and there could be better community benefits. Yet those people exist, and they have, very legitimate points of view, which I've tried to take on board and fix in reforms, etc. But it's just not true that the majority of people in the bush oppose action on climate change. So I think it's not easy, and it takes work, and it's judgment. Applying your political judgment, but it's also listening carefully to the arguments and thinking, okay, that's a legitimate issue. That's real. We should take that on board, as opposed to that's climate denial, disinformation. That's, we know from all the research that's no more than 9% of the population. So we're just going to have to sort of see through that and get on with it.
Holding your nerve. Obviously, last week was the first week back in Parliament. What's the mood inside what I would call an oversized caucus room last week and this week?
Well, I mean, as you expect, pretty positive. It's pretty positive. But the team's also seized of the opportunities of the enormity of the task, of the obligation. You'd expect me to say that, but I think it's also true. No one's sort of buzzing around hubristically. Everyone's delighted and pleased to be here, and pleased to be here with a big majority, but also wanting to get on with the job that the Australian people gave us in a very real way. And, their esprit de corps is good. I've served in, many different cabinets now, many, many different caucuses, and the esprit de corps is as good as I've ever seen it.
I was thinking back to after the 2004 federal, the Latham election defeat, and I remember being up in Parliament the first week back, which that would have been your first Parliament, right?
Yes.
That was, you're sworn in. Yeah.
Yes.
And you'll remember this then. The coalition MPs were up and about after that election win. And I remember a lot of the women coalition members were wearing hats on the first day as if they were going to Royal Ascot. And they were really leaning into the win. And even though I was just a staffer, I wasn't an elected member of the caucus. But I was thinking to myself, losing sucks. And what a contrast it would be for the first time Labor MPs walking into this caucus this time around after the back of a big win. Is there almost like a buddy system in which some of the older heads kind of put their arms around a couple of the class of 2025 coming in and saying, hey, look, this is how we kind of just show them the ropes?
Yeah, informally. I mean, there's no sort of formal structure and no allocation and, he's your buddy and he's your buddy. But informally, I think certainly I know there's new colleagues that I, look out for, and I've rung and said, how are you settling in? And, feel free to ring for advice. And it's a big I remember my first 6 months as an MP, and, to be very honest with you, it wasn't entirely pleasant. Like, it's just such a big change in your life, and you wanted all this time to be an MP to get here and think, oh, man, well, it's just like a wave comes over you of detail and a new life and, change patterns and hiring staff and running an office. And, I remember it being quite confronting, even though I'd run an office, as a staffer. I'd been a chief of staff, but being an MP is, just it's a different world. So yes, there's certainly MPs, you tend to look out for people from your own state and people from maybe not that far from you. and, just sort of check in on them, take them out for dinner if you've got time, or even just a text message, etc. So, yes, there is that sort of informal system, I think.
Let's turn to your portfolio of climate and energy. One of your key efforts in your own seat of McMahon was stopping the development of the Eastern Creek incinerator in Western Sydney, where you live and also where you grew up. Just interested in getting your reflections on, growing up in a working class area, and often these communities are seen as a bit of a dumping ground for high polluting projects. You've got a personal connection to that particular campaign. Is that sort of influenced you and how you view this portfolio and what you want to do going forward in terms of this next government?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Where I grew up in Smithfield in Western Sydney, where I still live, actually, and the people I live with. And again, yes, you're right. Western Sydney has been in the past very poorly treated over many generations, and a lot of developments that just wouldn't be acceptable anywhere else have been put there. And, some we're living with, and some, we've fought. But certainly, again, I think it comes back to that point. When I walk around the suburbs that I live in and represent, actually, it's not true, one, that climate change is an inner city obsession. I see a lot of electric vehicles where I live, and a lot of multicultural groups come and talk to me about climate change. It's etc. But it's also where we've got so much at stake. I've got constituents living in apartments without air conditioning. It gets hotter and hotter. Kids trying to do the HSC in sweltering heat. Elderly people, not much tree cover in many parts of the electorate. These people, there's a lot of stake at climate change for people who rely on Labor governments. So while climate change wasn't a thing when they were gathering around the Tree of Knowledge at Balcolden or in Balmain, it's nevertheless a pretty core part of the Labor agenda to deal with it, in my very, very strong view.
Can we talk about gas market review? You recently announced a review into the gas code of conduct and have stressed how new gas projects need to offer something to the domestic market. Give us a bit of a background to this debate and what the situation is with the current market and why we've been exporting all of our gas.
So, look, obviously, even on a podcast with a friend, I'm not going to preempt the result of the review. So that review is underway with me and Madeline King, and we've still got plenty of work to do. So I don't know where it'll land. But in terms of your question about where it comes from, yes, there's a problem in that too many Australian industrial users, come to me and say we can't get gas at a decent price, and there's a supply problem. And then but we have no shortage of gas as a country as a whole. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. Now, the reason for the review is we've got 3 different levers to deal with that problem, some of which the previous government put in place, some of which we have, heads of agreement, thing called the ADGSM and a code of conduct. And Bella and I thought, well, they're all sort of up for some sort of either sunset period or review. So why don't we just have a holistic look at this? Because I don't think, some people say there should be no new gas. That's our colleagues in the Greens. That's not correct if Bass Strait's running out and we need gas for industry and the 5 million homes who use gas for home heating. And gas in the energy system is very flexible. You can turn a gas-fired power station on and off at 2 minutes' notice, which you can't do with coal. So as you're moving to more renewables, it's very handy to have. But the people who just say, well, just we need more gas, just to prove more gas fields and everything sorted out, I don't see that being right either, because at the moment, the almost inevitable result is that a lot of that gets exported. And so we're back where we started with industry coming and complaining. So, again, we're working those issues through. I'm not preempting, but there is a disconnect there, and it's important that we do a thorough job of analysing how we got here and what potential policy levers government might have to fix it.
The last election, the coalition proposed an East Coast gas reservation scheme, but the Labor Party opposed it. Why? What was this?
Well, it wouldn't have worked. It was written on the back of an envelope. They didn't consult with anyone. And the thing about a reservation, you can argue, you can have the historical argument, should it have been done in 2009 or something, or even earlier? Would that have avoided us being in the situation we're in now? You can have that conversation, but where those contracts have been entered into and they run to 2035 and, that's sort of a period. And constitutionally, you couldn't rip them up if you wanted to. I think there'd be a big sovereign risk and international reputation issue in ripping them up anyway, but you constitutionally couldn't do it. So you can apply things to new fields or to uncontracted gas, but that's not the majority of gas we're dealing with. So you've got to think this issue through pretty carefully. And I haven't found anybody in the gas or in industrial markets who thinks, well, the opposition got 100% right. That would have worked, because that's not the majority view in the sector.
In our 2 episodes ago, we had Daniel Andrews, former Chief of Staff Lissy Ratcliffe, on the show, and we briefly touched on the book Abundance by
Ezra Klein.
Yeah. And we were just talking about how it's sort of making the rounds at the moment. One, have you read it? And two, we've been talking about streamlining regulations around gas projects, which all sounds very familiar as well. Do we have a regulatory red tape challenge in your space that needs to be addressed, or where does this conversation fit in your world? I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I have read it. I read it a while ago, actually, before it became so prominent I could read it sort of when it came out, which is not that long ago, but and I think it's a useful contribution. It's very focused on America. It's about America, but obviously it's got some teachings for everyone. So I think it's very useful. And I agree with the fundamental premise that social democrats should get on and deliver, So that's basically the premise, get on with it, guys. Stop fuffing around and don't worry so much about not in your backyard, and just get on with it and deliver for the people. Having said that, I wouldn't want to oversimplify things. I don't think you can just say, well, they spent a lot of time in the book talking about renewable energy, which obviously was of great interest to me, but I don't think you can just say, well, every solar farm and every wind farm just gets a tick. It doesn't matter where it is, doesn't matter who complains, doesn't matter what the environmental impact is. I'm not on board for that, So I think it's a bit nuanced and balanced. So again, it's in a very American context where they have a very different system. They have 5% of their houses with rooftop solar. We have 33%. So, very big difference. And we've got just a very different system. But nevertheless, I thought it was interesting and useful, and, good to have those voices out there. We do have a job to do. It's no secret that Murray Watt's working on environmental planning reforms, what the Americans would call permitting. We call them environmental planning. So there's a job to do. Does that mean, everything gets a tick? No, but it does mean hopefully we get to yes or no faster. It's about speed for me. Not everything should be approved, but let's not spend 3 years, deciding whether we're going to approve something. It's better for everyone, even if it's a no, that they get that earlier and they can move on to another project and the community has peace of mind. Or if it's a yes, get to it earlier and get on with it.
Let's go to renewables, and particular offshore wind becoming a big part of this conversation. I'm interested in your reflections about where we are heading at the moment in terms of investing in offshore wind. I know it's not as easy as just plonking a bunch of windmills in the ocean. I know it's a lot more complicated than that. But certainly, where I grew up in Gippsland, obviously there's an area off the coast of South Gippsland, which is earmarked to be an area where there's offshore wind. And a lot of folks in the Latrobe Valley that have, basically lived off of or worked in the energy industry are kind of they're excited by the idea of new jobs coming into the area that in the renewable space. But there's been a lot of operators in the offshore wind in that community promising that this is coming. And now folks are starting to go, when is this coming? Is it taking a while? I don't know. My question was, is this taking too long? But my question actually now is it taking a while? I don't even know. What are your expectations here?
No, it is taking a while, but it was always going to. This was never about 2025 or 2026. It's important for the future. It's important for jobs, for the Gippsland when the coal-fired power stations close. And you're right, I do get a lot of, support from the community in Gippsland for it. It's one of our 6 zones, but it's one of our biggest and the first one we did. And it's the most advanced in terms of, community consultation and understanding. But it's a big new industry to start. So, if all goes well, an early might get some early power, in 2030 around that period. So it's never designed for, the 2030 target or right now. There's a lot of planning to do, environmental approvals, industry to build. And yes, to get the nub of your question, there's a lot of headwinds around offshore wind industries around the world. It's, there's a lot of difficulties they're facing, but, nevertheless, so, of the projects I approved, the 12 licenses I issued for the Gippsland, that was 25 gigawatts. Some have hit the fence, which is unfortunate, but we still have around 20 gigawatts in the mix coming. which is more than the Victorian government's target. So, some of those will proceed maybe faster, some will slower, some won't happen. Like, that's what happens when you develop an industry. You don't have a glossy document and a linear graph and everything happens perfectly. There are headwinds, and, Gippsland is a zone which is perfect for offshore wind. It's one turn of one turbine offshore is as much as the solar panels on your roof all day. So, that's one turn, and they turn 15 times a minute. And, they're very energy rich, very jobs rich, because they work so hard, they need to be maintained. That's jobs. Because they're in the ocean, that's ships, that's ports jobs. There's a lot of jobs there. So, and it's always, it's much more consistently windy in the ocean than on land. Onshore wind is more variable. Offshore wind is much more constant. So it's important for the future. It does take a while though, and we deal with challenges, and we'll get an industry up in Australia. I mean, it's existed in Europe since 1991. It's very new here. We're way behind the game, but in other parts of the world, it's just part of life.
So, I mean, you must have cracked the shits then when you found out there was almost like a astroturfing ginger group up in the Hunter trying to argue against it. We don't need that kind of debate. Well, I mean, obviously we need a debate, right? People should voice their opinions. But when it looks like it was just basically propped up by, angry branch members of the Liberal Party, I mean, at what point do you sort of go, oh, come on, are you fair income? Or, I mean, how do you manage that kind of?
Well, it comes back to that first point. I mean, about working out what's real and what's not. When I work out, and I meet with groups and whatever, I work out I'm dealing with climate denial, and just, we're not here to listen to you. We don't want this project. I say to them, quite honestly, I can't work with you on that. I can't help you with that. If you don't believe that climate change is real, you don't believe in renewable energy, I'm sorry, this is not a fruitful conversation for either of us. And yes, there have been sort of, active groups and the disinformation. And sometimes you look at it and you go, I look at the Facebook groups and it develops from anti-offshore wind or genuine questions about offshore wind, and develops to climate change denial, then moves into other, conspiracies, etc. So again, my job is partly to separate the wheat from the chaff, separate what's a real concern. Where's the community got some legitimate gripes here, some issues that we should take on board? Every zone I've declared, I've made it smaller after the consultation. I'm not apologising for that. I'm proud of that. That shows that we do listen, when there's a bird that's a kestrel that needs to be protected that hadn't been reflected in the first draft, etc. We'll listen. Where people say, we're concerned about fishing. Okay, well we can work together on that, because it's a common myth, a common misconception that that whole zone no one can fish. Just not true. There's fishing in Europe, plenty of fishing around offshore wind. A lot of people say that fishing improves. Let's work together on that. Where it's no, we don't care. Sometimes it's whataboutism comes up. I say, well, they say, we don't think we can fish. I say you 100% will be able to fish. And then they say, oh, what about this? They're not really. Yeah. That's when I work out, well, this person's not really interested in a genuine conversation about making this work. But again, there's plenty of people who are, and you've got to try and work that through. But yes, disinformation offshore wind, sure. I mean, Wales exists with offshore wind around the world. I'll tell you the two biggest impacts on Wales is ship strikes. Well, no one's suggesting we should abolish ships. And climate change. Well, that's why we're doing what we do. So you work these issues through.
The Australian Fin Review reported that COP31 is likely to come to Australia next year. And if that's the case, there's a chance that you might be made the United Nations climate chief.
COP president, I think, is the title. That
is it? Oh, right.
COP president, yes.
Chris, you've got a lot on your plate right now. How are you going to manage that one as well? Plus, follow your footy team. Walk us through that.
Oh, well, the footy's okay. I have it on. Try to get to a home game and have it on the background if I can't. Look, the Prime Minister will make further announcements about the senior personnel, but the COP president is the person who brings it all together and makes it work. I've worked with several COP presidents now. In the last 3 COPs, I've been asked to chair a stream of the negotiations, which is an honour for Australia, and, I'm very honoured to do it. We hadn't been asked for 10 years, and then I've been asked to do the last 3, so there's a bit of a pattern there. And the last one was a big one. I chaired the climate finance negotiations, which was the big thing in the last COP. So I'm used to that sort of thing. And yes, it is hard work, but it's vital. It's vital not only for the world, but for Australia. We've got to be a key player in these things. We've got to be at the table. We're now more and more seen as a good leader, and we're more and more seen as being, so important to this conversation. It's good for Australia because a COP is the world's largest trades fair. A lot of investment decisions made by people who go to COPs. It's good for the Pacific. There's never been a COP in the Pacific. I was in Tuvalu a couple of weeks ago. I stood on the narrowest part of the island. You can read all the briefing notes you like, and I've read them. You can read all the books about climate change you like, and I've read them. Until you stand in the narrowest part of Tuvalu and see what impact climate change is going to have, and basically, we're talking existence or not, then, the Pacific deserves a voice here. So I want to run a very genuinely Pacific COP where there are issues. When is the with all, I don't want to sort of single point out, when's the Prime Minister of England, or Britain, or the President of France going to, hear about what we need to do for Samoa if it's not at a COP, So this is our chance.
You spoke on the 7:30, what was about to say, the 7:30 report. That's showing my age.
Still call it, no, you and I are of a generation. I still call it, indeed, I said to my office, I've got to go to the 7:30 report. It's always going to be the 7:30 report. It's not 7:30.
Good, absolutely. Well, let's adhere to that then. You spoke on the 7:30 report last night about renewables and wanting to hit 82% by 2030. That sounds super ambitious. 2030 actually isn't that far away, given we did a podcast 6 years ago and it felt like it was only last week. How are we going to get there?
Yeah, look, it is not far away. We're going to get there. We continue hard work. It's better than, again, you would think, reading some newspapers, but we've got hard work to do. We had, I don't want to start nerding out because I wasn't last time we spoke, but I've become an energy nerd. There's a confession for you. I can speak fluent energy now.
You really can. I'm impressed.
Couldn't do that in 2019. But we've added 4.4 gigawatts last year renewable energy. That's a lot. And that's not investment decisions. That's not thing that's coming out of the pipeline. That's up and running, built, connected, supplying energy today. But there's 15.6 gigawatts that have been approved in the pipeline over the last financial year. That's an absolute massive pipeline. But, we've got to work, my job and everyone who's helping me and the regulators and the states, everyone's got to work to make that a reality, that 15.6 gigawatts a reality. You've got to get the planning approvals, the investment decisions finalised, the supply chain dealt with, the labour force issues dealt with. We had $1 billion of investment announced yesterday as we were recording from a big global fund. So there's confidence out there. But yes, it's a big lift. We were at 33% when we came to office. We're hovering just over 40 now. It depends quarter to quarter. We've hit 46, but it depends what quarter, because it varies depending on the weather and how how much water is in the dams and what have you. But yeah. So we'll get to 50 in the not too distant future, and then it's drive on to 82.
What about the other side of the chamber? What are you noticing from them post-election in terms of they changing their tune that much when it comes to the question of climate and addressing that and investing in renewables, or is it still the same sort of songbook they're singing from?
No, maybe I'm just naive and optimistic sort of a soul. I thought maybe post-election, and a drubbing, without being too, I think even Susan Lee said they got smashed. I thought maybe now, and they lost basically every seat in every city. Like, you can drive through Sydney and Melbourne quite successfully these days and not hit a Liberal. You'd think that that's a message, climate and energy count. And I think it's an acceptance of modernity. If you show that you believe in climate change and you want to do something about it, you accept the modern world. If you don't accept that, then you are not fit for government in the modern world. It's a pretty key entry test for a government. And when the Australian people, I'm not suggesting they go through every policy document and assess, the two plans in a minute detail. But if you're not prepared to act on climate change, you are not fit for office in the modern world. And the Australian people have now made that clear, very clear, in the last election. They made it clear twice. And, I thought maybe after the election, the Conservative Party in Britain worked it out. You can't win elections until you're serious about climate change. David Cameron worked it out many years ago. It appears, I'm sorry to say, they haven't.
Is nuclear ambitions dead in Australia after this last election?
Yeah, I think so. They are sticking with the policy, but it was never realistic. And now the inflection of time, they said they could get nuclear reactors up by 2037. That was fantasy. But they're not going to be able to say that next time because 3 years will have passed. It's just going to be more in the distant future. And by then, our renewables will have been built out. and I think it just becomes increasingly unrealistic for them.
Last couple of questions, because I know you're up in Parliament and the bells are probably going to ring again. But I've got a question for our listeners that are probably in the climate activist space. I think in my own capacity as a community organiser, not that I do any sort of organising particularly in this area, but just seeing my colleagues in the community organising space that are in the climate movement, that they have some wins, but they feel like it's a struggle, and they feel like it's a struggle to get the attention of decision makers, whether it be government or business. And I sort of thought about a colleague of yours, Annika Wells, after the Matildas had a great run in the World Cup, and then there was a big call for why isn't government giving more funding to the sport? And I'm going to put words in Annika's mouth here because she would have said it far more eloquently than this, but she said, get your shit together. I'm getting lobbied by 10 different soccer agencies at the one time, or all the other codes. No, just to send, one group. And I thought that was great advice. Is there any advice that you can give to, I guess, climate activists in which want to make change but need to get the ear of a progressive Labor government to make change in this particular space?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, Annika's not wrong, but, the climate movement, there's lots of them and lots of different groups, but, I see as many as I can. There is also, I think, an increasing degree of coordination. My main message is this, and I think a lot of climate activists get this, but maybe it's useful for me to say it for some others. Take the wins. Celebrate the wins. When we do something good, I know maybe, some climate activists want more and, will say, unless you're dealing with this or that, you're not serious. If we get to 82%, that's a huge win. Take the win and celebrate it. I'm not saying then don't call for more. That's fine. But when people downplay what we're doing as a country and dismiss it, I think you're playing into the climate denial hands. Yeah. What are the climate denial? What's the big argument these days? Andrew Hastie and others, it doesn't matter what we do. We're 1%. It's what China and India do. In a funny sort of way, some climate activists play into that argument. Say, what we do domestically doesn't count. It's the coal exports that count. That's all we care about. Well, I'm sorry, what we do does count. I'm more than happy to have a conversation about fossil fuel exports and working to improve our renewable energy exports to, help the rest of the world decarbonise. That's a legitimate conversation. But don't downplay what we're doing here, because you're making it easier, I think, for the deniers and the delayers and their argument that, what we do here doesn't count. That's a mistake. That's a very, very big mistake. And no one loves that argument more than the right-wing climate deniers. So let's what we do internationally is very important, but what we do domestically is important. And when we make some progress, we do something good, let's celebrate the win. By all means, push for more if that's what you want to do. But let's give a bit of it makes it harder for me, to work on the wins if people don't say, oh, that's good, because the rest of the government's quite entitled to say, well, I did all that work, and then, he just gets beaten up because this other issue over here, it doesn't help the debate.
Last question, podcast. What are you listening to walking the dog these days?
I listen to a lot, including your good self. I listen to a lot of climate podcasts, a lot of history, politics. I thought what I might recommend out of all of them that our listeners might like. I'm a bit of a nerd like your good self. I like Canadian politics. So I listen to a weekly podcast on Canadian politics called The Curse of Politics. It's one Liberal, one New Democrat, and one Conservative, and a host. And they talk about the week that's just gone in Canadian politics, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, I love it. As soon as it comes in my feed, I listen to it. Obviously, there's some bits I don't really fully understand, the nuances, but they explain it pretty well. And sometimes the echoes from Australian politics are unbelievable. They're having a debate about housing and how we can get more houses built and what young people think about housing. You think, this is exactly what we're going through. And they're all really good commentators. They're really smart. So The Curse of Politics, strongly recommended.
Check it out. Chris Bowen, great to have you back on the show. It's been too long. Thanks very much for your time. And I know you're flat out at the moment with the sitting week, so we do appreciate you taking time out of your diary to have a chat to us.
Always good to chat, mate, and thanks for what you do for progressive politics in Australia. It's a very important contribution.
Good on you.
Good on you, mate.
Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Shout out to our new Patreon members of our socially democratic community, including Pax, Jat, Philip Kim, and Aussie Pat Leyland. Welcome aboard. And team, make sure you send us your mailing address so we can send to you your socially democratic welcome pack. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.